Good morning, everybody. Good morning. This is better than I thought, considering all the people that are at Camp McDowell. So thank you all for being here this morning. Loyal pilgrim. You have done pilgrimage. You've done church on pilgrimage. Yeah. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, help us to reflect on the ways that you invite us into community. Invite us to be travelers, to be pilgrims, to wander, to learn, and to see our church as a source of that pilgrimage. May these next 45 minutes speak to each of us in some way and invite us into pilgrimage in any way that we can. We ask all this in Christ's name. Amen. This is a picture. A few of y'all have been into my office. I was thinking about this talk about church on pilgrimage, and this is how my bookcase is set up right now. And these are all, with the exception of chubby little Jack's face, these are all pictures from pilgrimage. On the bottom left was 2010. I was in Greece, and that was my friend Ali. We were taking communion at Eucharist, and I think my sister gave that picture. The picture on the right, Anne and I beginning the Camino de Santiago. That's in Saint Jean in France. That was 2009. That was our first date, but that's another talk. This picture is a group of youth that I took to Greece in 2005. And I couldn't make it fit on the PowerPoint, but up here is a 2006 youth pilgrimage to Canterbury, England. And those are just the pictures on my office. And so every time, this is the bookcase that has my Bibles. So often if I'm doing preparation, I am looking at those pictures. Anybody know what this is a picture of art reflecting who? Charlton Heston, the Gospel according to Charlton Heston. Moses. How long does Moses spend in the wilderness? 40 years. But he's not alone. He does it with a community of people. He is with his people, and it's odd that God is constantly promising Moses a new land. And if you recall, I think it's in the end of Numbers, Moses actually dies before he leads his people into the land. But it shapes their time in the desert, shapes their understanding, which still applies today, of this idea of wandering with community. Genesis chapter 23, I am a stranger and an alien residing among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, so that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The reminder that we're strangers and aliens. I mean, that's God is the stranger among us, but also that's often the way that we take. We are a stranger. Deuteronomy 10, chapter 19. You shall also love the stranger, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. A lot of this comes to kind of our theology around caring for people who often find themselves as strangers. But it's a reminder that we have this identity as well as strangers in the land. I love Psalm 146. The Lord watches over the strangers. He upholds the orphan and the widow, but the way of the wicked he brings to ruin. God is watching over strangers. And then 1 Peter, dear friends, I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners to keep away from worldly desires that wage a war against your very souls. Here, Peter is actually not talking about people being strangers in a foreign land, but strangers on this earth. That this earth is not, our final home. To consider what it means to be a stranger. Has anybody heard of Egeria? Tom has. Anybody else? Wow. So in the 4th century, I think one Sunday in Egeria was a wealthy woman who in 381 makes her way up Mount Sinai. And this is what she writes. The mountains, she tells us, are ascended with infinite toil because the path doesn't rise gently like a spiral. So she, together with the priests and monks from a nearby monastery, had to go up on foot. They couldn't use donkeys like modern travelers to the Grand Canyon. Instead, had to climb straight up the whole way, as if up a wall. And then somebody writing about her own reading Egeria's journal, she didn't feel the pain of the journey because she was eager to reach the point where the 10 Commandments were given to Moses. When she reached the summit, she found only a single church in a cave where she was told Moses had dwelled. The mountain was so holy, she tells us, that none of the monks or priests who lived nearby were permitted to live on its summit. This is somebody that's made some notes. Egeria, I believe the excerpts of her journal were first found in the 11th century and then more in the 18th century. But there's an actual recording of a person who makes pilgrimage. And she goes to Jerusalem as a person, and she records what she experiences. She actually goes during Holy Week. And so she writes about the services that are taking place in Jerusalem and about that experience. But what it gives us is this idea that people are making a journey somewhere. I'm assuming she probably travels with people and with help. She's not going with her church. But she is making a journey, and that's kind of one of the early stories of pilgrimage. And then this is one of the ancient pilgrimages as well that Tom and Janet are going to speak about in a few weeks. The Camino de Santiago, which people have walked for 2,000 years, a lot more frequently the last 100 years as Basque country's kind of opened up. But people have made a journey for 2,000 years walking, leaving their doorsteps somewhere in France, and by the time they get kind of up to Saint Jean, which is right over the border, right there, kind of the trail becomes a little bit more formalized. But people have traveled with the hopes that they're going to learn something, to walk into the place where James's bones are interred, one of the ancient pilgrimages. So I have this picture from I don't know if this was the first trip to Greece or the second, but why travel as a group? Why do we travel as a group? So I kind of wanted to walk you through some of the things that I have learned and show you some pictures. This was from Greece, that 2010 trip, and let's see. I don't think anybody in here was on our Greece pilgrimage, were they? No one, huh? Interesting. But this is the place where Lydia was baptized, and so here, this is a whole group standing there. And our trip that went last summer went there as well. I was not a part of the group by that point of the trip. But this is the place where Lydia in the book of Acts, who is the first person baptized in Europe, is baptized. And so this group is here. And one of the things that's interesting, Ollie, who was one of the priests at Holy Communion at the time, I was the minister for youth formation, he kind of intuitively just asked, hey, has anybody here not been baptized? We have this assumption as Episcopalians that everybody's baptized. And it turned out there were 3 people on the trip that weren't. And Michael, Marcello, and Sally had not been baptized. And we did a baptism at the site of Lydia. I was looking back. So this is Corinth, where Paul goes and spends time in I think the 18th chapter of Acts, but it's also the community he's writing about in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And this is the trip from this summer. Here I am in 2010, standing a few feet, must be to the right of this picture. And I just thought it was funny because this is Sean Harbour, who is a youth of mine, whose father was just ordained and is associate priest at Holy Trinity. Just kind of interesting how worlds collide. But that's from a 2010 trip. Here I am in Tangu, Myanmar, in 2012 on pilgrimage to learn about kind of Christianity in a minority context. Pilgrimage can be fun. That's Dorothy Cochran in a market in Jerusalem. And pilgrimage can be serious. That's the picture that was taken that I used. I switched to my Facebook profile, and then 6 hours later, kind of things unfolded here at Saint Stephen's. But that's the picture from that day. We had just celebrated Eucharist in Corinth together. So I thought I'd read a couple of stories. So when I was a youth minister, I'd give each of the trips. So one of the things that we're trying to bring here is to have our young people go on pilgrimage. We'd give them a journal at each trip, and these have been sitting in my bookcase, and they haven't been brought out since they were probably written. And so I started opening them, and I just want to share some kind of thoughts. I've been so nervous. This is from 2005 in Greece. I've been so nervous these coming months about being in charge of such an important spiritual journey. All of these kids are so well behaved that I really should just let God work his magic. I'm probably 25 at this time, just so y'all know. It's probably midnight where we are now, but there is not much change in our first 2 days. They're mostly spent in airports and on planes. As I prepare for my nap, I'm so thrilled that tomorrow our journey in Greece begins. This we'd gone to an evangelical church in Greece. People kept raising their hands like antennas trying to catch the Holy Spirit. Although I disagree with so much of what they said, God was there with them just as much as he was with us. Just because I like my form of worship doesn't mean theirs is wrong, but it sure was strange. Afterwards, they had a lunch that we were invited to with red, white, and blue balloons to celebrate our independence. It was the 4th of July. They were wonderful and accepting and totally kind. It's neat to meet people from all over the world. So many refugees worship here because this was Christian worship in an evangelical church in Greece, so it had brought a lot of people that were refugees. After church, we caught a bus into Athens, our first trip to the big city. And I share that, I think it's interesting. I was kind of reading in a message board recently. This person was asking questions about ordination in the Episcopal Church, and they already had their theology figured out. And they're asking if it was okay to kind of to arrive at this position. And I kind of in those situations, I never respond. It's kind of curious for me to get a survey of the landscape. But it was interesting to me that somebody considering going to seminary would already have everything figured out. And I'm here to tell you that even having gone to seminary, you don't have everything figured out. But my wondering was, what would it be like to have an ethic of curiosity? And so part of the reason, it's interesting to me that the theology that they have, it's already a reflection of the community they want to be in. But a different idea, and I think where pilgrimage comes into mind, is what does it mean to be open to learning? Because part of the idea is if you're wandering, you have to receive help from others. You're kind of dependent upon on the hospitality of others. I mean, that's anytime you travel, even if you've paid for everything, you're still dependent on other people caring for you. So this idea, the reason I'm reading is because part of going to a context that's outside of my comfort zone is that you can see that my own theology is being changed and shaped. We went to Canterbury in 2006. In the hostel, and I share this with you, I just thought this was kind of beautiful. In the hostel, which is really quite nice, I had my first e-contact with the world. I got to tell the girl I was dating at the time that I loved her. Ron told the staff that he'd be leaving in September to be at St. Mary's Cathedral for 2 years. Actually, I'm really grateful and appreciate all that he's done for me, and I'm glad to know he'll be in Memphis for 2 more years. I feel weird saying that Ron has been a close mentor the last several months. That's Rondell Bain, who is an associate clergy here. This is 2006. But I'm drawing attention because here I am halfway, well, not halfway around the world, but across the pond at least, and it's impacting the way that I think about my relationships back home. Traveling, pilgrimage, and community, and I'm considering how my relationships are at home. This is from the Camino that we walked in 2008 with young people. And I've just made notes. So one of the things that when we were, and we did this with our pilgrimage to Israel as adults, most places that we would go, we do Lectio Divina, which is the tradition of reading scripture where you read it 3 times and it's not about getting it right. The first time you read it, you're asking what's a word or phrase that stands out. The second time, maybe a little diving into what that means to you. And so I just made some notes that Laurel was, she was worried about other people. Mary Ham was upset about how others question her, and she was scared to say that she was a Christian. Sean realized he couldn't have peace without suffering. This must have been after the first day of walking, and Sean had a hard time making it over the Pyrenees Mountains. Or no, that was from Saria, but still, there's a lot of climbing on that day from Saria, the first to Port-au-Marin. Is that right? Port-au-Marin, where you walk across the bridge. Would that be about 5 days out? Yeah. Caroline had grown that day to. This was Lectio. I don't know what the scripture was. I didn't write that down. But she was learning to respect others' beliefs. Camille was learning that pilgrimages are suffering. Cliff was finding harmony in his hike. Lewis was what he noticed, that living in harmony is salvation. George, water saves, water saves, water saves, even on a hike. So kind of neat, some of the reflections from the young people on that trip. In 2010, we had done a Lectio Divina on Matthew chapter 28. And the word that stood out to me was after the Sabbath. And I was asking the question, is Sabbath, is it significant that what takes place after the Sabbath? And I was wondering why. Something in here stood out to me. Right now, Mike has been making fart noises, disrupting our session, and I'm wondering how to let go and not worry about it. I know it's disrespectful and rude, but he's a 16-year-old boy striving for attention. It's also difficult to be serious with a few of the 9th grade boys, and I don't know why. It seems to be obvious setback on the trip, and I only wish it was different. It's difficult traveling with people sometimes. And yet, one of the reasons I've been really hopeful that this is a model we can have at St. Stephen's is what I found. What you find is, those trips are often huge benchmarks in people's lives. It gives them a sense of self. Back then, in the last trip I led with youth was 2010, but we actually didn't let them take cell phones, if you can believe that. I had a phone tree set up. I would call, and it would send a message to all the parents, and I had a phone. I don't think we could get away with that today. But it was part of the experience of letting go and being uncomfortable. This was a picture from our St. Stephen's trip to the Holy Land. We went in 2020. There's CJ and Verna and Verna's friend at the Sea of Galilee. We're on a boat, but the sea's not much bigger than that. I don't know if that's how you picture it. There's a larger part of the group, Gene and Chris, that are here on the Sea of Galilee. Bring back memories? Yeah. One of the things you have to experience when you're pilgriming in a foreign place. There's our group from Israel.
Is that the group that was out in
2020, yep.
We were glad you made it back.
I was worried we weren't for a little while. Picture's not great. That's the River Jordan, where Jesus is baptized. I don't know if that's a specific place, but that's where people go to. And we're renewing our baptismal vows. This is a Catholic service in, excuse me, in Emmaus. And I thought it was helpful to read. So, some of y'all may recall this. I tried to write a little bit from different places with what was happening in the world. And so this is what I wrote from Emmaus. One of the most impactful stories to me in all scriptures is the walk to Emmaus. In chapter 24 of the Gospel according to Luke, 2 disciples are walking to a village outside of Jerusalem. A stranger accompanies their journey. At the end of their travels, the friends sit down to break bread. And at that moment, they realize that it was their friend Jesus who was with them on the journey. I love the response of the disciples when they realized this. Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us? Looking back, they realized just how special the moment was. Today, we venture to the Benedictine Abbey of Abu Ghosh. The abbey rests in a small town no more than 15 kilometers or so from Jerusalem, and the site of where the Crusaders believed the town of Emmaus to be, and where this experience recorded in Luke occurred. We walked into the nave of the chapel as one of the priests began officiating Mass. I couldn't quite capture the words of the song the congregation was singing, but those gathered for worship were familiar with the tune, and the sound reverberated and was echoing beautifully off the stone walls. The last remnant of incense lingered enough to awaken the senses of the sacredness of this special occasion. Our whole group slowly entered. Some took seats. Chills washed over my body in a way that I had not experienced in Jerusalem. The singing was intoxicated, and I was moved to tears. As I watched the priest lead the congregation in worship, the deep sense of hunger filled me. I felt the profound sense of awe and wonder, and at the same time a deep sense of sadness in the place where the disciples' hearts were burning after consuming bread with their friend. I'm not aware of ever desiring Eucharist so profoundly in my life. I am hungry, but this meal would not be for me. In all honesty, I have a rather Catholic understanding of the Eucharist. I'm not bothered by the metaphysical teachings of the church. While I often teach with the explanation that God is fully present, I'm okay with the teachings that parse Socrates and Plato's exploration of metaphysics that inform the Catholic Church's teaching on the Eucharist. I've never had such a deep desire for the Eucharist as I felt this morning, and yet know this is not the time and place for an Episcopalian from halfway around the world to push the boundaries of the Catholic Church's teaching on who should receive. I'm also wondering if my hunger is deeper than just this morning's experience in Emmaus. As I travel with 27 others on our pilgrimage from Saint Stephen's, I'd be remiss to say that there isn't a little anxiety as our trip nears an end. The world seems to be losing its cool over the coronavirus, and the impact on travel is worrisome. This would have been the first week of March. It is likely we'll be here a day or so longer due to canceled flights. Loved ones back home are anxious for our group's arrival back in Birmingham. And the news of quarantines, the market, and travel restrictions have everyone a little on edge. And yet, in the midst of our worries, when we have surrendered the need to know what will happen, and our control of the situation have been fully present to each other, something remarkable has happened. Our hunger has been filled. I've even felt from time to time that my heart has been on fire. We've laughed. A few have even danced, maybe in the market with the with the Corona. That's the irony of that. That was a Corona what she was drinking, wasn't it? We've laughed, we've danced, we've built friendships, we've unpacked the scriptures, and we've come to know that God was fully present in our midst. I'm grateful to be in community that will never deny anyone who is hungry for the real presence of God that we've come to know in the Eucharist. It doesn't matter if you're single, divorced, widowed, or married. It doesn't matter if you're young or old, straight or gay, white or black, poor or rich. Nor does it matter if you're Episcopal, Catholic, Baptist, or Christian curious. It doesn't even matter if you're a Republican or Democrat or still haven't figured it out, because everyone is invited to fully receive. All you have to be is hungry for God. When we share in this gift, our eyes are open to know that Jesus is in our midst. I think I go on a little bit more about COVID, but I offer that because I don't think that kind of understanding can happen on your own. You have to be in community. And there's something that happens, and it's why. I mean, all of y'all are here in a Sunday formation offering. I don't know if this is the best way to teach because you're listening and not kind of offering something back. Something even more profound happens when you're in a small group, and that's why I know that we're trying these Being With models or Frank Leeds EFM. What happens when you're really in community and sharing? Now imagine what happens when you go away and you're in community and sharing. You become really awakened to the way that God's at work. I'm glad Anne's not in here. She's still a little bit bitter that the first time we've been away from our children and 13 years of marriage, we had to come back so quickly. But I imagine that for those that traveled on the Greece trip, it was quite a different pilgrimage after Anne and I and Whitney and Ashley left after 36 hours. But if you didn't read it in the magazine, I thought this was interesting. This is Pat Bill's reflection from the trip. 21 pilgrims from Saint Stephen's left the United States on Tuesday, June 14th, arriving in Athens, Greece, for a journey of a lifetime, to walk in the footsteps of Paul as he traveled to Ephesus, Corinth, Thessaloniki, Philippi, and Athens. We were expecting a trip to the famous landmarks such as the Acropolis and the idyllic islands of the Aegean Sea like Santorini, peeking into the cave where John had written the book of Revelation, and standing amidst the ruined Roman city of Ephesus were just a couple of the highlights. Enjoying each other's company and some delicious and legendary Greek food were tops on our list of things that would definitely happen. Worries including testing positive for COVID and missing our cruise ship to the islands. Once we arrived in Greece on Wednesday, and after dinner, we took a treacherous taxi ride up to the top of Mount Lycabettus, I believe, in the center of Athens to watch an unbelievable sunset in view of the Acropolis. We took lots of photos and selfies while counting our blessings at being in such a magnificent setting. The next day, which was our first real day of touring, June 16th, found our group visiting the Acropolis in the ancient city of Corinth, where we heard stories of Priscilla and Aquila, Paul's hosts in Corinth. John, our leader and rector, celebrated the Holy Eucharist with us under the shade trees amidst the tumbled monuments and remains of homes and businesses in the ancient city. And then back to the city of Athens for a dinner and a silly, fun game in the lobby of the hotel. We laughed so much, maybe even too much, and then retired, ready for the next day of pilgrimage. Pat goes on to talk about what happens next. I'm not sure that I really want to, I probably do need to go there. At 3 a.m., the texts and emails began to hit our phones. Some of us learned a few hours later, but all of us gathered in shock in the lobby of the hotel as John relayed the tragic news of Saint Stephen's. We couldn't believe it. An active shooter at Boomers. How could that be? And then the reality of the victims. These were our friends, the pillars of our church. people we counted on each and every Sunday to lay our table for the Holy Eucharist and make sure our requests for prayers were heard. Now what? Some of the group wanted to go home and some needed to go home. Others remembered that they'd be at home with this terrible news to process. John asked us to stay and finish the pilgrimage. Honestly, it felt like a foreign request, but we stayed, we journeyed, with heartbreak, sadness, uncertainty, and determination. Each day we honored our friends with prayers lifted to the heavens and the holy sites. We lit candles in so many of the churches we visited, each of us praying and remembering. We had a service of remembrance in Mary's home site near Ephesus. We retreated there with St. John after the loss of her own dear son. We read the 23rd Psalm, and we named our dear saints Bart and Jane and Sharon, and read the names aloud of those in attendance that night at Burruss. We ended with the Lord's Prayer. Throughout this pilgrimage, our participation was 100%. We took turns reading from Acts to enliven ourselves to the relevance of the sites, and we let our imagination flow with the conversations held long ago in these historic places. At Philippi, our beautiful guide, Nana, sang to us in the amphitheater to illustrate the amazing acoustics. And then Keith Cromwell and Diane Mooney sang, "Let It Be." We all joined in the chorus. It was a truly magical moment. The last night in Thessaloniki, we ditched the idea of dinner in the hotel and moved our group to the center of town where we celebrated our love of each other and our friends with great food and laughter. We cried and we laughed. The trip was transformational. We helped each other up and down the stairs and through the schedule each day, making sure we were all together and not missing anything. We expressed our shock, disbelief, and began to grieve. We held on to what we knew for sure about our special place, Saint Stephen's. Paul's message to the Corinthians, the Ephesians, the Philippians, and the Thessalonians was one of love and how to cope in a world filled with fear and suspicion. These sermons of love, letters of encouragement, and lessons of Christian life brought us safely home to St. Stephen's. The 17 remaining pilgrims returned on June 23rd to a changed world. As we drove past the church on Overton late that night, the flowers, signs, and balloons covered our sign in front of the church. We were changed also. We will miss our friends and great servants of God, and we will always remember their service to God. Once long ago, I was looking for a church home. God led me to St. Stephen's with a simple children's poem. Here's the church, here's the steeple. Open the doors and see the people. Yes, indeed, see the people. So that was Pat. I think what I hear in there, now there's been several people from St. Stephen's that have said this, so I'll acknowledge it. Like, John, you're not allowed to lead any of us out of the country again. Third time's a charm, right? It doesn't matter if there's coronavirus or something terrible happening. It's impossible not to go on pilgrimage and remain changed. I mean, that's the kind of fundamental thing about the Israelites wandering in the desert. They're changed. They understand what it means to care for people. It's why, and I know this kind of tension's always raised with, how do we care for people in the midst of our community, especially immigrants. I know that's a kind of a contentious issue, but it constantly in Scripture is going back that people have been foreigners in a place and they've had to rely on the care and help of others, and that has shaped their understanding of God. Part of what it means to get out of our own comfort zone, to get out of our bubble, is to put our lives in the care of others, teaches us about God's own compassion, puts us in the kind of place of many of the people that have gone before us. So I think more than anything, just want to encourage this ethic of pilgrimage. I also know that it'd be kind of foolish. Not everybody has the means to go out of the country. If it's a trip of a lifetime and we offer another trip and things are tight, please let me know. And we can figure out ways of kind of making that available to everybody regardless of means within our community. We're fortunate to have some of those resources to be able to make sure that everybody can participate in what we offer. Questions. I've led you through 37 slides, I think. 27 slides. I have another one. Yeah. Will you journey with me, and where should we go next? Any thoughts?
What do you do to kind of prepare in terms of structure and, what are we doing each day to make this some kind of meaningful conversation and experience for God?
Usually, and I found this, one of the tensions I found is when I started at Holy Communion and we hired a company, Wonder Voyage, that had a passionate Christian leader that wanted to take control of the spiritual development of the youth and creating and it was, went with the same person. His name was Sean. I can't remember Sean's last name. And what I found is I wanted to have more control, so we switched in 2008 to a company that put together, these curriculums. Lots of people are traveling. There's lots of companies that kind of create Christian travel because it's a huge market. I think it's a little bit off-putting for several people when they go to the Holy Land the first time and they see the kind of commerce that's taking place, and you have that idea of Jesus kicking out the money changer in the temple. It's like, this is ridiculous. But then for those that have traveled, yes, that may be a reality, and we're in a place that has 4,000 or 5,000 years of incredible history. It's impossible not to be changed. But what has to happen is those meaningful conversations in a group, and that's why you travel with a group. It's one thing to go on your own, and I suspect that people going on their own can have a profound experience, but when you're with people from your community and you're sitting afterwards and you're like, okay, we're going to have a Bible study on this. Where did you see God in the midst? That's when it gets to be the meaningful transformation. What we did in Israel is we did morning prayer. We did the readings from morning and prayer every day on the bus. And that actually became the template for our community during COVID. That's where that came from. So we started reading the reflections, and then I started kind of journaling about some of those, and that became our model. It doesn't, we have these practices built within our own tradition of morning prayer that give us kind of guidelines. It's more about the kind of stepping apart. I usually let the tour companies kind of come up with the agenda, and then I ask for the time to then process. It's beautiful to be able to have Eucharist any number of places. We had Eucharist in Corinth. In Israel, we had Eucharist in the garden. There's some debate where Jesus was buried. There's two sites, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and then there's a site where they have found a tomb in a kind of wall, and there's a garden outside of it. It's possible Jesus was buried a third place that nobody knows of. I suspect it was the garden, but we were able to have Eucharist in that place, according with our own tradition, with our own prayer books. I think we asked everybody to bring their prayer book, right? What did we do? Did you guys have a prayer book and just kind of...
I think you used your phone.
I had a prayer book.
You had
I had a prayer book.
Yeah, you had yours.
Yeah. I had a small one of those was small needs. But I probably used my phone too. Yeah. But that's kind of, I let the tour companies do that, and then it's my role, or whoever's leading, to kind of come up with the way that you create the opportunity for the community to reflect.
John,
Yeah.
I think the other part of that too, preparation, was the time we had before we left.
Yeah.
We had class, so we could study the scripture,
Yeah.
and the settings that we would be in, that kind of, was very helpful.
So both trips we did here, we had a small group gathering in 228 on the Sundays, 8 to 12 weeks of classes. So that people kind of know, but you still don't, you kind of have to be in a place, like there's something about standing in an ancient church, and then you have, we're reading about, I'm trying to remember which trip, when you're reading about Jesus unrolling the scroll in the church, and he's talking about how he's going to, I think is it Matthew chapter 4, he's kind of, where he's talking about he's the kind of embodiment of what is to come. He's probably reading Isaiah chapter 43 about the suffering servant. Like, you begin, you're visiting these churches. It begins to make sense. To walk into an old synagogue, and you can see the footprints of old synagogues and churches. Those remains exist. there's no doubt in my mind that you're not in those very places that Paul stood. Some of the places are probably, speculations of where the Crusaders believe it happened, but many of those places probably really are, an accurate depiction of where Christ or Paul was.
So where are you thinking about going next?
I don't know.
You hadn't considered it?
I've had a few other things going on. I mean, I think I'd love to take another group to the Holy Land. I personally want to go to Iona. I don't know if that's a group setting or where I'll go when I'm on my sabbatical. I'm planning to take a few months next summer. I'm 24. I'd like to go there, but I know that's a wonderful place for groups to go. I think it'd be hard to take a big group, but I know there's a lot of people that have hiked the Camino. Gene and Richard Botsford just got back from walking the Portuguese route. And that was a meaningful experience. So kind of helping people make those plans to travel. Yeah, Tom?
So we were thinking about the Camino. We looked at group versus self-guided, And I wonder if you could comment, the groups we saw tended to be like groups together, they walk the Camino together, talk together, da-da-da-da. And then, of course, we had a backpacking, we call it tramley.
Yeah.
A trail family, which you lead people along the way, walk with them for 3 days, and then you separate.
Yeah.
Yeah, they became our group. And we'd see somebody the first week, didn't see him for 3 weeks, see him in Santiago, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So comment about your thoughts about both of those sort of ways of doing it.
Yeah, I think the beautiful thing about the Camino is it allows you to go at your own pace. So theoretically, the historical ways, you have all these albergues along the route, and if you need a day to stop or you only want to walk a few kilometers, there's one you can. When you have somebody plan out your trip, and it's booking your room, and you're not staying in the open air dorm for 500 in Roncesvalles with the Symphony of Snoring, you kind of have to go a certain amount, but you kind of overlap with people and you see them again. I remember my sister went on the 2008 trip on hiking the Camino, and we would kind of spread out and we'd stop every few miles and let the rest of the group kind of catch up. But we allowed a little bit of freedom on that trip. And my sister was really struggling, and she saw somebody she hadn't seen, that she'd seen a couple days earlier. And for her, when we were reflecting, I still remember this 14, 15 years later, she talked about how that person was Jesus Christ to her. It gave her the strength. He came along and encouraged her, and it was the strength that she needed. She felt like she couldn't finish the day without that person. So that's kind of the beauty of kind of recognizing. We had a dinner with a lovely German couple that, and when we got to Santiago, and we had met them a few days earlier, and Ann thought she heard them say they hated Americans. I don't know what they said, but she was like kind of going over this story in her head, and you ended up becoming kind of friends with them, and we had a meal with them when we saw them in Santiago. I don't know if they got there a day before us or after us, but we ran into them because you end up in the same place.
So positives on both sides.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Another possibility for pilgrimage is Italy.
Really? Yeah.
Which I did back in 2015 and really have wanted to go back.
Yeah.
Going through Rome and St. Peter's in chains and St. John's outside the wall and the catacombs and Assisi, where St. Clare and Damian and St. Francis, Siena, St. Catherine. Some of that, it was very meaningful.
Yeah. And it's with the point that, and really the point that I'm trying to drive home today is that there's meaning, there's something beautiful about traveling with your faith community. It'd be hard for me to believe that people don't see that community differently. Having that kind of experience is profound. To rest, to laugh, to worship, to be with people for longer than you're comfortable. It's a profound gift.
So the
question is then, can you not do a pilgrimage that's not in sacred places and get that same?
Yeah, but I mean, you can. I mean, I guess if you're worshiping and studying, could you go out west to the Grand Tetons and hike with a group from the church and pray and have Eucharist? You could, yeah. But there's something about following in the footsteps of people that have gone before you. If you walk into Canterbury Chapel, and I think the steps are worn down because people have made that journey, and that's like part of the meaning of the ritual of us saying the same words essentially that have been said for 2,000 years that people have gathered. It's the same thing to walk in the place that people have sought for meaning and purpose for 1,000 years or 500 years. That adds to the meaning and depth of what we experience. I mean, in Celtic Christianity, there's an understanding of a thin place. Y'all probably all heard this. I think there is something about traveling somewhere that's, I don't know, being open to that. That there's something that intentionally connects us to God. God's everywhere without a doubt, but it feels a little easier to experience in some places than others.
And it brings alive a whole different way of thinking about reading, what you've been reading, and what you've been studying your whole life, and then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, it's real.
It's real.
It's real. It's very enlightening.
Yeah, visiting, especially the ancient places of the Bible, it just makes your kind of connection to that place more proximate. Yeah, Gisela?
One of the things that I learned about the Camino de Santiago de Compostela is that it was as much a spiritual as well as a political initiative, because the Muslims were sort of conquering Spain, and so in Cluny Abbey was actually a big instigator of encouraging people to go on that pilgrimage, because that meant that a lot of Christians were setting up businesses, and there was this, trafficking of Christians, and that was a real important political as well as a spiritual journey, which I think is really interesting. It sort of adds a layer of, especially historically speaking, if you look at why they did that, I'd never thought of it that way.
And then there's a monument maybe less than a day out in Santiago when the Pope visited there 20 years ago. But obviously that brought a lot of revenue and business, probably very similar, adds meaning.